God will use who you are wherever you are. So to find meaning at an engineering firm or at a Starbucks or whatever your job is to just be who you are. If you are an empathetic encourager, be that wherever you are. Don't feel like you need to be something else, because that's kind of weird, actually. You're like, I think I should be something other than God created me to be. Well, that gets weird really fast. Just be who you are wherever you are. And you have to trust that that's your contribution to God's kingdom work. And it's really that simple. I know that's not easy to embrace, but it really is that basic from a theological perspective.
All right, so today on this next episode of the Persisting in Purpose podcast, I have Chuck Bomar with me. Chuck and I go pretty far back. We met in 2007. Chuck was speaking at a fall retreat for Campus Crusade. I was leading worship. It was, I believe, in Ventura, California. And it was one of those situations where we had someone booked. I think it was Mike Erie. And Mike backed out, and they reached out to Francis, hey, can you come in? And at this point, Francis is way booked. And he's like, I can't do it, but my college pastor, Chuck, is great. It was kind of cool how all of that lined up. We met. I was about to graduate college, and Chuck's like, hey, we should connect after this. I have potentially an idea for you as you figure out stuff. And then he disappeared quick, and we couldn't chat. So I found his email online. We connected. And shortly after I graduated, December of 2007, and April of 2008, I moved up to Portland, Oregon with Chuck to help start a church, and spent 6 years there. And I spent 3 or 4 years leading the worship for that church. And it has been a fun time getting to know Chuck through those years, through these current years. And I think this is going to be a fun conversation because I've never met a pastor who is as entrepreneurial as you, and you've always been a serial entrepreneur, and you've spent a lot of time in vocational ministry as well. So there's a bunch of things that I want to unpack in this conversation. I want to start to kind of give us some context for the vocational ministry. When did you become a Christian? How old were you?
My first year in college. Okay. Yeah, it was like the spring of that year.
And so at that point, like, what was the point when you realized, like, moving into pastoral ministry was something that you thought you should do or wanted to do?
It was probably, I don't know, it was probably a few years later, because I actually didn't grow up in the church. Yeah. Went to church one time in high school, got free pizza, and then I didn't want to stay for the speech, so I left. But when I came to this like moment where for whatever reason, I just had this thought of like, I think what I'm saying is that I'm basing everything I believe about my eternal destiny on what the Bible says, and I should probably learn about the Bible.
Yeah.
So I actually went to Bible college for that reason. And then it was at Bible college where I studied things like baptism, and I was like, I should probably get baptized, you know? But I started volunteering at a church in the junior high ministry, and then I became an intern, and then I became the junior high director, and I just fell into it, I guess. Yeah. So it wasn't like an intentional thought process, a decision-making deal. I just kind of like went into it. Yeah. So it was probably a few years later before I kind of realized that. Okay. Yeah.
So you kind of fell into this pastoral ministry path.
Totally.
What were you doing for work at this point?
I was working at a grocery store.
Okay.
Yeah. I think I was working at a Safeway on the West Coast. It's a big chain.
Yeah.
You know, and so, yeah, I was there.
How long did it take for you to like take pay from the church? I'm guessing as an intern, you were volunteering potentially, or low pay?
Well, obviously as a volunteer, I wasn't getting paid, but then as a intern, I think I was making a little, But then as the junior high director at this church, I was making $604 a month.
Okay.
So I still had to work. Yeah, for sure.
So that's kind of the beginning of the pastoral ministry side. Like I mentioned earlier on, like I've always considered you a serial entrepreneur. And I personally consider that of myself as well. Where did that start? Like, how do you think that started coming about?
That's actually a good question. You know what? This is like, I think the first time where I thought about doing something like that was I heard about Amway,
Okay.
where you could sell these products or whatever. And I actually did it for a little while, but then I stopped pretty early. Probably
Amway
like
was
the majority of people.
MLM or no?
I don't know. I don't know what MLM is.
Multi-level marketing.
Yeah,
like a
yeah.
pyramid.
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I quickly realized, like, I don't think I want to do this.
Yeah.
But that was when I was like maybe 20.
Okay.
And that was the first time I started thinking about doing something on my own.
Yeah.
Yeah. I never actually thought about that question until just now.
And so what was that next step? So you're doing that. Like, what was the next entrepreneurial thing that you did in the midst of ministry?
I started speaking in public schools
Okay.
on abstinence, actually. And because part of my story is not abstinence.
Yeah.
And so I started teaching in public schools on that, and I started getting paid by groups like Crisis Pregnancy Center or maybe even the school itself. And so then I started to kind of just keep doing different things like along that realm, still kind of in ministry realm,
Yeah.
but doing kind of side things that turned into like speaking more and more and more, where I was traveling a couple times a month at conferences on the circuit or whatever, and then writing, and then started an organization to help churches with a certain, like with college students, and just kind of kept going. My first for-profit business venture by myself was probably in 2003, which was a trading of commodities deal.
Okay.
So yeah, it was kind of random, but
Yeah. When you say commodities, like, do you have an example?
well, what it mainly was doing was actually just trading foreign currencies.
Okay.
Yeah, went off on a
That's an interesting tangent.
Yeah. It was something that I got interested in through a friend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think part of the serial entrepreneurial, that's a tough word, kids.
Yeah.
Journey is navigating or it's just being extremely curious.
Yeah.
Like coming across things and being like, I think I could do that.
100%. I think like what I would say is I get bored really quick and I'm super curious,
Yeah.
which those can be really dangerous
Yeah.
attributes. And so with that, I have a serial problem of starting new things. And I just always done that. Probably even ties back to my childhood where I moved around a lot. So I'm used to new, I'm used to change, and I've grown comfortable with change and new things. And so I think that's part of, I call it a sovereign foundation, where I didn't choose to live in 11 homes in 7 cities before I graduated high school.
Right.
I didn't choose to have my mom and dad divorced when I was 6 months old, right? So I call it a sovereign foundation that in many ways is broken, but that somehow God uses to combine with the way he's gifted and hardwired you. And he combines that with the circumstances that shape those things. And I think that's one of the ways that when like God uses brokenness for good, it's one of the ways that he can shape it. And so I think it's part of just how I'm wired.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, one of the things that we can naturally, as people in general, but specifically as believers, we recognize how easy it is to tie identity to money. And you've mentioned to me that like in that season of moving so many times, like finances you weren't blessed financially while you were growing up. And so how did that impact, you're going into a career path that you sort of fell into that is not a financially lucrative. And so how do you think that impacted like the desire to do some of these entrepreneurial things on the side, is not wanting to be in a position that you were in when you grew up? Or how did you deal with like this view of money in those early years?
I don't know that I thought about money as much as the of a motivator.
Okay.
I think, and I grew up with a single mom who had to work two jobs to pay most of the bills, and she worked really hard. She also dropped out of high school when she was a sophomore, and my dad even earlier in life. So, I mean, education, money, I didn't learn anything about money other than you needed it to try to pay your bills. And so it wasn't like a pursuit of wanting a better life or anything like that. I don't think I was that smart. Like I don't think that I was that intentional. I just think it was like I was just kind of going. And actually, I just thought of my first entrepreneurial
Yeah.
pursuit, which I'm not proud of. But we would throw raves right after high school.
Yeah.
I was actually throwing raves and charging $20, and they would get a hit of acid when they came in the room. So that's actually the first entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was
way more embarrassing than Amway.
before pastoral ministry.
Yeah. That wasn't what led me into that.
They didn't coincide.
No. It was before I was even a Christian, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
an interesting business venture.
Yeah, that was yes, that's one way of saying it. Yeah, wouldn't recommend it.
Yes.
Nor would I recommend Amway. Not because anything against it. It's not for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hear you on both cases.
Yeah.
So when you started this pastoral ministry path, was that at Cornerstone the whole time, or were you at other churches and then ended up at Cornerstone Simi Valley?
Well, the church line real quick, like the one church I went to for free pizza when I was in high school, after I became a believer, I went back to that church and asked if they had anything for college students. And they said yes. So I got involved in the college ministry there. Got to know the college pastor a little bit. And then I wanted to go to Bible college. And that Bible college was about 45 minutes away. And the only reason why I chose that was because my friend Dwight, who I had met through Christian friends, got an interim worship pastor position at this small Dutch Reformed church called Church of the Chimes in San Jose. And I had no idea what any of it was. I just knew Dwight was moving to San Jose and they had a Bible college. So I moved with Dwight. I commuted to work, but I moved there to go to school. And so I got involved at Church of the Chimes. And that's where I got in junior high ministry. And then the summer, that was in 94, 95, 96. And then the summer of 99, I was working at Hume Lake Christian Camp, just outside of Fresno. And that's where I met Francis. And then he hired me to come start a college ministry. And then I left there in 2008 to plant the church in Portland.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. That's an interesting connection.
Yeah.
How did you get connected to Hume?
I had a friend that worked there.
Okay.
And the summer of 99, I was actually working, I was no longer at Church of the Chimes. And I was working at Lam Research as a semiconductor manufacturer in the purchasing department. And I got laid off. And they gave me a 13-week severance package. And I didn't have anything to do, and they needed some extra help up at Hume. So my friend Cliff just goes, "Hey, man, why don't you come up for the last 7 weeks of summer?" And so, actually, that was the summer of 98. Sorry. Okay. And so that's how I got connected. And then I got to know some of the people that were running the high school camp. And somehow it came up that I ran a middle school ministry and this kind of stuff. And so they hired me for the next summer to come be one of the lead counselors for the high school camp.
Okay.
There were 7 of us that did that.
Okay,
so,
nice.
Yeah.
I think a fun little tie through is that when I was making the decision on whether to move to Portland or not, I went to Hume Lake with you when you were teaching.
Yeah.
And we were like, you said, "Hey, come with me." I think it was maybe a weekend. Spend a weekend or a week with me,
Yeah.
and we can just talk about it.
Yeah. I think it was like a winter camp, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so went up there, and after that made that decision to move.
Yeah. Yeah. I taught at Hume probably for 15 years or whatever, after I worked there.
Yeah.
Like every summer or winter, some adult conferences. It's a great
Yeah.
place. That's actually where Barbara and I started dating too.
Okay.
So
That's awesome.
yeah.
So you switched over to working at Cornerstone with Francis.
Yeah.
That church was exploding, like getting really big, getting really popular. What was the catalyst that led to planting a church in Tigard, Oregon?
Yeah. Well, I had always kind of thought that I would plant the church at some point. At that point, I was thinking at some point I might plant the church. I wasn't around church planting or anything. I just thought, for whatever reason, that I might plant a church sometime. So when I got hired on by Francis, that was kind of part of the equation, the conversation. Like maybe at some point I would plant. And so the idea was maybe I'll start a college ministry and then plant out of that somewhere in Southern California, which didn't end up happening, but it was always kind of part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think, I just came to my mind, do you think that part of being a serial entrepreneur is maybe a reason why you would want to start a church? Not viewing it as a business, but just kind of that building things. And
Yeah, for sure. Starting things, new things, it's all part of it. Nobody's going to plant a successful church and not be entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
It's just not going to work if you don't. I mean, in some ways it's even harder than a business. So, I mean, it's just not going to work. You need to have a specific wiring for it. And I know a lot of church planters that do it because they've been in ministry for a while and they feel like, I just want to go do this on my own.
Yeah.
And they fail. Certainly not because they're a bad person or not gifted. They're not gifted in that way. Just because you're a good pastor doesn't mean you should start a church. And so it's a very unique calling that most people should not try.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is not for the faint of heart.
Well, right. It's very difficult, and you got to be wired a certain way to be able to make it work. Mm-hmm. And I think that's God's design. I mean, even when you look at Scripture, the apostles were very few people in comparison to the rest of the body. Like even if you go to Ephesians 4:11, like the list of the leadership gifts, prophet, evangelist, apostle, teacher, shepherd, those are for the leading of the body towards unity, which means that those giftings are by far the minority of Christians, like by a long shot. Prophet, probably the least, evangelist, probably the next least, and apostle, they're probably all amongst the least giftings of people, which is good because we're like very opinionated. We're type A. All three of those gifts are all type A. And even look at Scripture. You just look at their personalities. Peter, Paul, I mean, you go on and on. It's going to be very strong personalities that are going to drive things forward. And if you have too many people like that in the world, it's a problem. So it's by far the minority.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was more than you asked for.
No, that was great. I love that. And I think that leads in well to this idea of, I think myself and I would say many others, I always assume what others think, but I feel like I have a pretty good feeling of what the masses believe. As Christians, I think it's easy to believe that vocational ministry is like the highest calling. And I think sometimes when we don't have some of those gift sets that you just said are like by far the minority, we feel that we aren't, we're not used as much as someone in a pastoral ministry role. And B, it feels harder to necessarily have purpose. Like, man, my purpose and identity are in Christ, yet I don't know how to translate that into my vocation.
Right.
what would your thoughts or encouragements be for young men or young women who are navigating this? Like, I don't feel called into vocational ministry, but I want purpose with my faith in my vocation.
Yeah. So maybe I can hit this from a few different
Yeah.
levels. Like, I mean, biblically, if you look at even just the parables Jesus told, by far the majority of them are in a workplace context. Scriptures talk about the work like over 800 times. I mean, it's ridiculous the amount of times that it's talked about, because by far the majority of people are in that context. And so it's applicable,
Yeah.
From a ministry standpoint, I'm just speaking as somebody that was in full-time church-based ministry for 25 years or whatever, over the span of 25 years. If I'm really honest, we can be pretty arrogant about that. And I don't know if it's a weird way of like justifying our own position or whatever, but like I've worked with one individual that used to say like we have a higher calling. And although on one hand, yeah, like the priests in the Old Testament, I guess you could say that, but it's not more important, or more valuable. So it depends on how you define higher, right?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we feel like in ministry, what we're doing is the most important thing. And so we create structures and programs, and we think that everybody needs to be a part of it because that's what everybody needs. And frankly, I just think it's arrogant. I've always thought it was arrogant, even though I fell into it a little bit.
Yeah.
But I still fought that because I just don't think that's the way God works. Like, if you take like the Apostle Paul,
Yeah.
right? And he goes around and he's planting all these churches, like the book of Acts. It's a 35 year flyby historical overview. There's not one command for any Christian today in that book. It's just a flyby historical narrative. And he goes and he plants these churches and he puts people over them who are now going to appoint elders and this kind of thing. What we don't understand is like sometimes we go, like Matthew 28, the Great Commission, all this stuff. But what we fail to realize is that those churches only succeeded because people stayed.
Yeah.
They worked in a community. They were a part of a community. And they lived life together for the sake of the gospel, right? But they stayed. They were consistent. They weren't the apostle or the evangelist. They were working. What I usually say to people is, like especially younger, when they're thinking about like I'm just wrestling with this question, God will use who you are wherever you are. So to find meaning at an engineering firm or at a Starbucks or whatever your job is to just be who you are. If you are an empathetic encourager, well, just be that wherever you are. Don't feel like you need to be something else, because that's kind of weird, actually. You're like, I think I should be something other than God created me to be. Well, that gets weird really fast. And it's self-deprecating, not in a comedic way, but in a really sad way. It's like, no, that's just all you need to be. And so the members of the body are all serve different functions. It's very clear in Scripture. So why are we trying to think that we should be something other than we are? If, I don't know, a mind doesn't really work well as a kneecap.
Yeah.
It'll actually be very poor kneecap. So just be who you are wherever you are. And you have to trust that that's your contribution to God's kingdom work. And it's really that simple. I know that's not easy to embrace, but it really is that basic from a theological perspective.
Yeah. And as you were talking, I think what I also realized is maybe one of the reasons why we glorify it so much and kind of wish that was a path we go, is because it feels a little more straightforward. Like utilizing your giftings, and who God has made you. Part of that is actually discerning and understanding how God has made you. And not all of us have processed that or realized that. But I think in different pastoral roles, we have pretty clear pictures of what that looks like to walk in with the Lord. And so it's like, well, I can step into this and I just know what to do. Now, it's not as simple, I'm sure, once you're actually in vocational ministry as a pastor. I said that weird pastor.
Yeah.
That's the Spanish word for pork.
Now I want a taco.
But being a pastor or a worship pastor, whatever it may be, kind of seems like it's like, I know what to do, and I feel like I'll be glorifying the Lord.
Yeah, and I think that's perception.
For sure.
And I think it's really sad. And I think it's, again, if I'm honest, it's perpetuated by people in ministry. And that's why I go back to like the pride, arrogance side, because I don't think it's ill will or ill intentioned at all. But I think there is this underlying thing where you think what you're doing is most important and everybody needs to be a part of what you're providing for them. Gosh, that just sounds arrogant, you know?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is humble too. But I think that carries over into the minds of people. And I think that comes out in preaching, it comes out in studies and content, and it comes out in conversation. And it's this, I think it's a scheme. I think it's certainly not godly.
Yeah.
You know,
when you say a scheme, like a scheme of the devil or the enemy, like to deceive.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like taking good and just twisting it a little bit.
Yeah.
You could probably find examples in the garden for that. But I mean, it's really twisted, so twisted enough that it's not clear.
Yeah.
So people get confused and deceived.
Yeah.
And even in their perceptions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that.
It also shows in church staffs that don't feel like they actually have to work or do something. They get into ministry and just feel like that we should just be a big family. And while there's truth in that, you're also taking people's tithe money to serve them. And so to not think that there's some responsibility with that or like accountability to that is crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy, you know, but I think people fall into this mindset of, well, I could just have coffee with my friends and use church budget. I mean, I wish that was a joke. Like, that's not a joke. People actually do that. Not everybody.
Yeah.
But I think there's this idea of like ministry should just be relational and there's no like work. And people don't cuss or, you know, whatever. People in my workplace cuss all the time. Well, Jesus took his disciples to some pretty rough places and goes like, this is where you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, God Pan is the sex god is flying around, apparently. And there's all these things. And he goes, yeah, you're going to come here. So there's just all this twisted thinking about ministry from all kinds of levels, I guess is all I'm saying with that.
Yeah. I'd love to, and we don't have to go deep on this. I brought this up in the last episode, and it's a tension that I'm still trying to work through. I think there's this weird tension when it comes to ministry and income. And like, I know personally, like I came to Portland and I basically worked every single weekend for years, complete volunteer. And I ended up being in 3 full-time jobs at one point, acting almost as a worship pastor, working at a restaurant full-time, and I started this photography business. And the point when I stepped out was like, I needed something to give. And it was really hard for me to navigate, like it's an awkward thing to get money from the church, vocationally.
Can be.
And so I think that it leads to a lot of tension in a lot of people because it's known to be not a high-paying job. And people can literally pursue it, especially in worship, I've found. I don't believe that was my heart, but people can pursue worship just for a paycheck. Like I can be a musician and make a paycheck, And then there's a ton of people who have a true heart for leading others in worship, and that gives them the ability to do that and truly invest in it. That's what those finances do. But I'm curious, from a leadership role and stewarding finances well, like, how can Christians who are going into vocational ministry, who aren't necessarily entrepreneurial, like we could get a little into this about how, especially in the early days of the church, like you were taking more money from your entrepreneurial ventures, far more than you took from the church. You barely took anything. But for a lot of people who aren't entrepreneurial, there's not necessarily that ability. And so there's a lot of tension around like, man, I feel called to do this, but I can barely pay the bills. I'm just curious your thoughts around some of that. I know that's not a very clear question.
No, it's okay. No, I don't think that ministries should be excused to go into debt. I've fallen into that trap a little bit early on with the junior high ministry.
Yeah.
I was like, I just want to do this. And then all of a sudden I'm realizing I'm putting my bills on credit cards and going backwards. So I don't think that's the reason. And I don't think we should justify that way. On the other hand, I don't know that we should be making the most amount of money either. So it is a very difficult thing to navigate because money is an idol in our culture, which is why we don't talk about it.
Sure.
Like you and I might talk about it, and I don't hide anything back, but it is an idol, and that's why you don't go up to ask somebody and say, so how much money do you make?
Right.
Like that's just a super weird question. And it wouldn't be weird if it wasn't an issue of idolatry.
Interesting.
So like when you talk about money in the church, especially how much a staff is making, I've always tried to like combat that and I used to tell tell our congregation how much I made.
Yep.
And it was super awkward for only for staff people that had been a part of a church for a long time. Everybody else in the church was like, that's so refreshing. Like, thank you. But people that have been in ministry for a long time was like, why are you doing that? It was super weird conversation. I do think that's awkward because of our cultural context, not because God made it that way. Mm-hmm. We make it that way.
Yeah.
And I just decided to be forthright with it. And as an entrepreneur, our board wanted to give me more money, but my pushback to them was always like, look, you guys can give me more money, but I'm not going to do any more. Like I'm already full bore here.
Right.
I would rather give the money to someone else so we can get more accomplished. It's more of a growth mentality, a building mentality. Even at the height of like our time there, I was making like $82,500 a year.
Right.
Where most people in ministry would say like, that's ridiculous. You know, most people in leadership in ministry, like the leader of a church would say that was ridiculous. For me, it was like, well, I didn't need more. I did have outside stuff. I wrote and everything. So, and you're just trying to reinvest everything back into the people that you're serving.
Right.
And so while also trying to raise up other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're just working with it. And then people might come in and go, yeah, we just don't make anything. Well, on one hand, you go like, well, welcome to the nonprofit world in general.
Yeah.
Because the whole business model is we hope people give. Mm-hmm. And so you just don't have a lot of money you still got to pay for the building and the different things. You just don't have the money to pay people more. So it's not like it's purposeful pursuit of poverty. It's just a practical reality that you just don't have the money.
Yeah. Do you think, Francis Chan in his book, Letters to the Church, when he had left Cornerstone, he started more of the house church movement up in the Bay Area. One of the things I found interesting is this home church model was developing pastors within it. So you're developing people to lead other churches, but every single pastor wasn't paid. Like each one was vocationally in another thing and leading home churches. Part of me, when I read that book, I'm like, let's all do this. Like every church should be this way. And I don't think that's the case. But my curiosity for your perspective is, do you think that more people in ministry should be bivocational, where you may or maybe are paid partially through the church, but also have some role in the world, whether that's entrepreneurial, like you or me, or working at Starbucks, or doing something like, what is your perspective on that?
The longer someone is in ministry, the more disconnected they are from the realities of everybody's lives that they're serving.
Absolutely.
It's just a fact. And you can't help it. You get in an echo chamber. And so the question is like, can you really serve them the way that they need to be served? And while there is a role, a priestly role in the life of all people, that's really important. And so I'm not saying take that away entirely, but there is a reality to it where you lose touch with the practical realities of people's lives. So if I had my way, by far the majority of church staff would be co-vocational.
Yeah.
And that's probably an entirely different series of
we don't need
podcasts,
to
but
go deep into that.
I just know that like business owners in my church, I had a much more credibility with them because I actually owned businesses on the side.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, you can actually relate to my world a little bit.
Yeah.
And then the priestly side could have actually in some ways more impact because it wasn't totally detached from their reality.
Yeah.
And so, and then the house church thing, I do think there's something to it where, yeah, in Francis's context at the time, nobody was paid anything. And he made money from speaking and writing.
Yeah.
Everybody had another job. And I think there's its own issues with that model because everything this side of Christ's return is going to be broken at some level. It's going to break down. But it definitely saved money. And when they tithe, they try to put that out into the community. So it's a model that works for a lot of people. It also creates a very different social system that most people, a lot of people can't really thrive in.
Yeah.
So it requires you to be pretty extroverted. And
it's not as
certain type
easy
of person.
for seekers
who
have never been to a church context to go into that.
For sure.
But I think
but the Lord does use it.
In building disciples, like it's a great model for intentional pouring into a small group of people.
Yeah.
It can lead to a high amount of growth in a small group of people.
Right.
But it is harder. Like I think there is a reason why there's larger churches that it's a little easier to bring your neighbor or your friend who's never been in.
Yeah.
Without going like, is there Kool-Aid in the other room? Like,
yeah, it's just hard because like most things in the world, what we'll do with the church is we'll take a model that we like and uphold the strengths of that against the weaknesses of something that we've already been a part of. And it's just not fair. Like it's not a intellectually honest approach.
Yeah.
Both of them break down.
Yeah.
And in fact, those house churches, Francis is still a part of a house church, but that whole thing that started actually is not going. I mean, there's things going.
Yeah.
There's fruit of it that continue on. But, you'd start a house church and then all of a sudden now you're like, man, the kids are kind of crazy. Can we get somebody to watch the kids upstairs while we talk downstairs? Well, now you just started a children's ministry. You didn't think about it that way.
Yeah.
Right. And then all of a sudden, if more people start coming and it starts growing and the house starts getting too small, are you going to go, well, this isn't right? Well, maybe you have a model of multiplication and you break it off, but maybe you don't have a leader. So now, I mean, you can just easily justify smaller as better.
I really liked how you framed that as we can easily take basically the pros of one thing and compare it to the cons of something that we left.
Totally.
Rather than looking at the positives of both.
Mm-hmm. And the negatives of both.
And the negatives.
Because they're both there on every
For
context.
sure.
And I have a preference. and something might really be much better for you personally or your family. But that doesn't mean what other people are doing is wrong.
Yeah. We can do the same thing in dating relationships.
Yeah.
You break up with someone,
Right.
and you pursue someone who has positives that were the negatives of the other, and maybe overlook different negatives that person had. Yeah, that's fascinating. I was just curious kind of your perspective on that.
Totally.
So it's kind of fun that you're here in person. I'm in North Carolina, you're in Portland, and we were on a conversation the other day just kind of talking about how this transition has been going. And 3 weeks later, we figured out, hey, there's some videos I can help you for one of your businesses. What if you just fly out? I'll take care of that. And we have this opportunity to have a conversation in person. But what we were talking about yesterday, you mentioned that a lot of people questioned, while you were still in ministry, buying a shipping business. Like, a lot of people said to you, like, I don't get it. Like, why would you do this?
Yeah.
And I'd love for you to kind of share why you did that as a lead pastor, and talk a little bit about this idea of core competencies.
Yeah. Well, why I did it was we had started 5 congregations and the system was kind of tired, but I'm a starter builder. So I went to my board and I said, I don't think we should start another congregation for at least 2 years, like not even think about it for 2 years. And they all agreed, but then that created a problem for me, because then it's like, what am I going to do? Because I'm not going to maintain well. And so I asked them permission to like go out and like do something else on the side while obviously upholding everything I was committed to. So they agreed. So I did that. That's why I went out. And then it was like, what industry might be growing or have, potential upswing or whatever. And after about 4 months, I ended up landing on delivery. The other piece of that is that in order for me to do both of these things, I need to operate within my core competencies. And what I mean by that is like the things that I naturally am wired towards and do well without really thinking about it. And in delivery, you have people, which generally speaking, I can relate to people well. And then there was a high efficiency thing on delivery. You have to design how many trucks, what kind of driver, and what route. Like there's all kinds of things that fit my core competency. Efficiency is a very big priority just naturally in my life. I'm always thinking about what's the most efficient way to wipe down a shower. Anyways. So for me, although it seemed for other people like this is super random, like how does delivery fit into your life? Well, it actually fit in really well because it fit my core competencies, the things that I'm naturally good at. I haven't had to work really hard at creating a bunch of skills because I'm naturally wired towards these things, towards people and towards efficiency. And so delivery just kind of fit that. And so I talk to younger people about that a lot.
So how would you, we had this conversation yesterday, and I was kind of trying to figure out some of my own core competencies as we're in a transition season, trying to decide whether we bolster up the video production company and get that back to life, whether to invest a lot of effort and energy into building this new golf brand, whether to invest more energy into podcasts and owned media. But as I was trying to navigate what are my core competencies, I'm curious, we had a person-to-person conversation and I was able to share what I think, and you were also able to say, from knowing you for 17 years, here's what I see. What would you give as advice for an 18-year-old, a 22-year-old, 23-year-old graduating college, someone who is trying to identify what are my core competencies? Do you think that can be done and you can kind of find, so I guess it's a 2-part question. How would they navigate figuring that out?
Yeah.
And can that be figured out outside of just going into jobs and allowing those to teach you over time.
Right. I think the first thing is you have to separate this conversation about doing what you're passionate about from understanding who you are. Like everybody's about your passion. I want to do something that I'm passionate about, or that I find meaning in, all that stuff. That's absolutely beyond question, without question, the wrong starting point. One example might be, you might be passionate about orphans in Rwanda. So you start an organization, but your core competency might not align with what it takes to run the organization. And now you're burnt out, you're overworking, and you're stressed, and now you're going to give up what you were passionate about. So it's the wrong place to start. For me, it's like, yeah, you have to understand who you are, and you're not going to understand that without some sort of moratorium or explorer stage. You have to try different things. Otherwise, you're not going to really figure out who you are and what you're naturally good at. So you have to go through that explorer moratorium. And then it's like, okay, what do I just naturally think about?
Sure.
Versus what do I do well? It's like, what are my intrinsic natural leanings? So like efficiency for me. And although it probably sounds like I'm OCD on that stuff, I don't think I am, honestly, but I naturally think about efficiency. So like trying to get down underneath the surface beyond what you do as meaningful, but who you are in your core competencies. And then you want to do those things wherever you are. So that's where you're going to find contentment. You're going to be much happier in whatever you're doing. And therefore, you're going to find more meaning in it, because people are going to be involved. Whatever your core competencies are, you could do that in an engineering firm, or you could do that in full-time ministry. But if you're operating outside of your core competencies, you're going to struggle for contentment and joy and the search for meaning. And so I just kind of say, you got to know who you are. Don't start with the passion thing. Work within your core competencies and then find a way to utilize that towards what you're passionate about. Don't reverse the process.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, and this again could be its own episode, but like college and the current approach towards college, especially the college I went to, you declare your major when you go in. Before, at 18, I don't think most really understand what they want to do and what they're gifted at, what they're good at. Yet we're often I declared my major as a materials engineer. And for me, it was very much like, hey, I'm great at math and science. This engineering is one of the higher direct out of college paying things. Like, let's use what I'm smart in that can make money.
Right.
And let's go. And God kind of took that away from me and shifted me in a different direction that I think does align with some of these core competencies. But how do you think we who are approaching college as a step in our vocational journey can navigate some of these things? Because a lot of our degrees are leading you towards one direction that may not be passion, which you said to not pursue first, but it may not also be within your core competencies.
Right. Yeah. I mean, people that pursue passion and forget about their core competency are not going to find nearly as much meaning in that as they think.
Right.
It's far more practical than that.
Mm-hmm.
College, I can tell you this. I don't know one person that's working at a major corporation that's hiring people that looks for their college degree or where they went to school. I don't know a person.
Yeah.
They look at experience. What have you done? Now, I'm not saying college is totally unnecessary, but it's like nobody cares. Like, unless you went to an Ivy League school, and even then, that actually might raise different concerns.
Sure.
For some employers, but I think as you approach college, it's like, do I have to? Two of my daughters want to go into the medical field. Well, you got to go to school. Like
Yeah.
that's just, you just have to. If you want to be an engineer, you have to. If you want to go into business, though, probably not. In fact, it's like one of the most generic majors now. It's like liberal arts, communications, business.
Yeah.
And you get no experience in the business. It's all theory, usually taught by people that aren't running a business. I always say, like, if you want to go into business and you want to go to school, or your parents make you go to school, you should probably get a degree in finance or accounting.
Sure.
That's going to be by far the most beneficial for you. I have made a very good living off of small business owners not knowing how to manage a business. So finance or that. But so, I mean, I think you have to think about it in practical terms, not just, I don't know what to do, so I have to go to school as the next stage of education.
Yeah.
And I think more and more that's going that direction.
So potentially utilizing college to build strengths that would specifically for entrepreneurs and people who want to go into business. Like, what are some different areas that will benefit that career that are harder to learn
In college?
Yeah. So like when you say finance, like learning finance, you can learn that ad hoc on as you go, but it's a bit harder.
Yeah.
Like a lot of business strategies, all that, you can pick up incredible books, incredible podcasts, online courses, and learn a lot of it without college.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to be a business owner, I would say go get a job with somebody you can learn from in an industry that you feel like your core competencies fit in.
Yeah.
And then buy or run the company. Like, you don't need a college education for that. In fact, in most cases, that's just going to prolong your process.
Yeah.
And I know that's super unpopular. Even in my own home, that's unpopular. So, but that's what I think. But at college, I still think, I even tell my girls this, and they're going into nursing and PA med stuff. I always tell them the most valuable asset you'll get from school is very much likely the relational network that you build.
For sure.
So be around the right people. If you show me your friends, I will probably be able to show you your future. So choose well, because it's going to drive and impact not only who you become, but where you land.
Sure.
And so that's what I tell my girls.
Absolutely. I would say moving to Portland when the economy crashed and being completely outside of my network, outside of God maybe specifically shifting me away from engineering, is one of the biggest reasons why I didn't get an engineering job.
Yeah.
It was in a time where if you don't know someone who knows someone, like, you're not getting an interview.
Right.
Like,
It's relationally driven.
it doesn't matter if Cal Poly is one of the best engineering schools on the West Coast. If someone from Oregon State who grows up in Oregon has friends, like, they're going to get the job. So network is incredibly important.
Everything in life is relationally driven. So every job is.
Yeah.
So it's not just who you know, it's also who knows you.
Yep.
Those are two sometimes different things. So yeah, you got to be able to relate to people and communicate. A communication degree isn't necessarily going to help you do that.
Yeah.
Can.
Yeah.
And maybe your parents, you just have to go to school because your parents say you have to go to school. That's fine. But it's the amount of debt and everything else. It just doesn't add up.
A lot of times. Yeah.
In a lot of ways. So.
Yeah. So I'm going to try to summarize for those listening, because we kind of went in a few different directions and tangents. If you're trying to navigate and understand your core competencies, a few ways to do that is, one, live in community with people who can actually experience and see some of your giftings. That could be your parents, that could be close friends or mentors. It would be like, don't expect to have that at 18 all the way hashed out. Like,
Right.
I think we want immediacy. We want to be able to jump into the perfect thing right away. That immediacy is probably driven by a desire for passion, like something we're passionate at. So be willing to move into different things, whether that's using college and then trying something different out of college, doing some different roles, jobs, and start to see, where am I gifted? And then the next step is like being curious, I guess, like actually researching things that you are somewhat curious about, but maybe don't know if you're gifted in it yet. And through that, maybe it's a couple year, a 5 year, a 10 year, who knows? I'm in my 40s now and I'm still trying to figure this out.
Right.
Like it could be 20 plus years, but all the while, like trying to be faithful to the Lord in each one of those roles and steps. Like not necessarily think, like I think the way I simplify things is God has one specific role that if I can finally figure that out, that lines up all of my giftings, my core competencies, my passion, my spiritual purpose, then I will feel like I've made it. But I think in most things, what God continues to remind me is be faithful in the small things and be faithful along the way. This desire for a straight vocational path is unrealistic and honestly, potentially could lead to God not using you and gifting you even more than like pursuing these things. Do you feel like that kind of sums some of that up? Anything you'd want to add to that?
No, I just think like with younger people, it's okay to not know. Like that shouldn't stress you out because you don't know.
Yeah.
Like, it's okay. And I mean, only 25% of college grads actually have a full-time job when they graduate. And by far the majority of that 25% only have a full-time job because they got a job outside of their field of study. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's just a real thing that everybody goes through. And yeah, you're on a lifelong journey, we all are, of learning who God has made us to be. And so the idea of trying to find the thing that fits for you that somehow you're thinking God wants you to do is just unrealistic and perhaps like unfair to yourself.
Yeah.
You know, not only theologically incorrect, but it's just unfair. Like, don't do that to yourself.
Yeah.
It's okay.
I guess the last piece of advice I would add is when it comes to doing things spiritually that you're passionate about, like trying to create ministry opportunities, it's okay to start small and do things on the side. Kind of like what we were talking about, being co-vocational or even just like this podcast. I mentioned this in the last episode. I don't know if God wants me to do the last 2 episodes and he's going to use that for 1 or 2 specific people because he wanted to work in their heart and that's all it is. That's why God laid this on my heart. Or God could have laid this on my heart where I start small and this podcast becomes a primary focus of what I end up doing. But by just starting small, not expecting it to be the whole thing, it allows God to use some of those passions while not having it to be the primary focus and direction.
Yeah. Every large organization started small.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, FedEx started with 1 truck. Yeah. So you have to just do something.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, if you don't know what you want to do, well, just get a job. That's it. Like, don't overthink it. Just start. Just do something.
Yeah.
And you know, the Lord will teach you who you are and just try to walk with him through it, you know? So
now we're shifting into a more difficult discussion. You, in 2020, transitioned out of pastoral ministry. You said you spent about 25 years in pastoral ministry. And the past 4 years, while you have had some ministry related things that have come up, especially in recent years, and we can discuss that, it really became fully focused on being an entrepreneur, buying businesses, and using some of those core competencies in a different way. The first question I have around that is, naturally, our identity gets tied to things that God didn't intend us to tie them to. And with what we discussed earlier of like easily viewing vocational ministry as the highest calling,
Yeah.
how have you dealt with identity challenges, or have there been identity challenges that you've dealt with now that pastoral ministry is no longer a part of your vocation?
Yeah, I mean, I think every transition will bring identity challenges. So because you always attach your identity in some fashion or form to what you do. You just can't get around it because it's a whole body experience. So you're going to do it. And I don't beat myself up over that. It's just a practical reality. It's something to watch and to gauge, and to maybe pray through even, but you're just not going to get away from it. So any transition is going to bring identity challenges. In my transition out of church-based ministry on a full-time vocational level to just focused on the marketplace, there were a couple things. One is more of like a family identity, where my kids, that's all they knew. You know, on rainy days when they were real little, we used to go open up the church building and let them run around. You know, so the identity of the family and the way we functioned had to shift. So it's rhythms, it's all kinds of things. That was probably the biggest one. And my wife, like, her husband was always in ministry our entire married life. So that was a shift too. For me, if I'm really honest, it was actually just a relief.
Unpack that a little bit.
There was this relief of like, everybody's fighting against something in Portland. It's part of the culture. It's this activism that's almost antagonism. I got to tear something down. I got to fight against something. You're not just promoting something, you're fighting against something. And that would come at you. When Black Lives Matter hit, I literally had people in our church saying, racism doesn't even exist anymore. And then I had people in our church saying, if we don't post a Black Lives Matter sign on our website, we are racist. And you're going, how do I even shepherd this? Like, I don't even know how to go about this. Or you have a, Trump and Biden election, and everybody, all the pressure of that. And what's ironic about that is when you teach all the time, what I realize is most people just think you agree with them until you don't. And then it blows up. It blows up, whatever that means. So for me, it was kind of like the grind of that, not having to think about not only what to teach every single week in the grind of teaching, but just that pressure, that constant like tension, was just relieving. And I was like really grateful that I didn't have to teach up through the 2020 election in a community. Any social community is going to have challenges. Doesn't matter if it's a country club, an office, or a church. Any community is going to have social tensions, right? Just like every family has tensions. But when you're leading in that context and you're a leading voice in that community, man, I just didn't miss it. So it was really relieving. And I felt like, I could just be who I am without the pressure. I never felt like I was anything other than I am. But there's always this pressure of like, how much do I say about who I am?
Yeah.
Because I don't want it to be a distraction, or I don't want to be a cause of division, for sure.
And that got more and more complicated. as time went on?
In ministry?
I think in general, not just for you,
Oh, yeah.
but like as we entered that
Oh,
2020.
gosh. It was a mess.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Portland was literally blowing itself up.
Yeah.
It was just a disaster.
I love your honesty and kind of unveiling that a little bit. We've also had conversations since you've taken on these multiple different companies that you've purchased and brought to life. What are some unique ways that God is using you in the marketplace? Like, besides just like, being Chuck, a follower of Jesus, and shedding light to people, like, how have you seen him use some of those giftings within market to impact people in a unique way?
Well, directly and indirectly, I'll probably answer it. Like,
Sure.
So the biggest transition out of full-time church-based ministry for me into just the focus on the marketplace was the fact that in church-based ministry, staff would not only they would really desire specific amounts and specific types of time, right? And I had tried to be really sensitive to that. Then you go to the marketplace, and some of my managers aside, most of my employees would prefer me not to be around.
Interesting.
Because the owner's here. That's what they know. And they can know I'm a Christian. I certainly don't hide that. And so I had to try to figure that out. So directly, I think I've been able to create some economic mobility for people that has been really fun, super fun.
For someone listening to this who doesn't know what you mean by economic mobility, what does that look like?
Yeah. Building into them so they can be more economically sound, which then creates social mobility as well.
So practically, you
creating jobs,
brought people in to roles in leadership, because a lot of your businesses, you're more high level oversight, but you're not in the day-to-day operations.
Correct.
So a lot of these people you're discussing are the person you've brought in an operational role. Is that correct?
Right. So I have a model of in, on, and for. So maybe delivery company is the best example. Working in the business would be a delivery driver. Working on the business would be a manager who maybe is driving a truck every once in a while, but scheduling, hiring, all that kind of stuff, working on the business. And I go on for the business, which is really strategic for the business. And that's kind of the realm I operate on. And I always say that actually might be my next book, but it's that actually you might be able to switch from one to another, but you can never be in both at the same time. And you really need to spend at least 80% of your time in only one of them. You can't cross. You can only be an in and on or on and for. You can't be for and in. It's just not going to happen. And you can't do any two of them at the same time. So that's that. But creating entry-level management and ownership opportunities. And we've created all of them. Maybe they would have gotten it somewhere else, but at that time, they had not yet gotten an opportunity. And we were able to create that for them. And so that part's really fun. Indirectly, that disconnect between employer and employee in a personal level is a very real human barrier that you're not going to break down. It just is what it is. And so I started a nonprofit that we bring in as a partner, that we provide one-on-one coaching for our employees in their personal life. So that's an indirect thing that I've been able to create, but not really participate in. And so Ben is the executive director of that, and he runs all that.
And how has that been going? Has that been impactful?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, mostly because of Ben, yeah, for sure, and the coaches. So we have people take what we call a peace index. It identifies 5 different areas. We take to 2 where they're lacking peace the most, and we focus the coaching around those 2 areas in their personal life. And it's been really, really cool. So that's a little bit directly and indirectly. And I've seen both of those give my platform of witness as a Christian a boost.
Yeah.
which kind of unexpected and super cool.
Is there any resource that you have at this point that someone who owns businesses who is interested in that kind of concept of what you've created with a nonprofit? Is there any resource that led you to create that, or do you have any resources you've made at this point to help people know how to start something like that?
Yeah, not to like hand out what resources we use. I mean, the website's just mywb.org. It's WB stands for well-being. And that's just currently the marketplace one. It's going to be marketplace and church leaders because we want to. Ben and I both were in ministry for a long time, have a tremendous heart for the church, especially pastors. And so we want to really kind of not abandon the marketplace at all, like actually continue to expand that, but add a very intentional focus for church pastors and leaders. And so the site will switch a little bit. There'll be two sides of the site. Right now, it's just the market.
Is it fully self-funded, or are you fundraising for it?
Yeah, I just fund it. We're helping other Christian business owners that do donate, but it doesn't even remotely come close to covering the cost.
Again, we keep having these topics where I feel like we could have an entire discussion on that one thing, but I think that's a really cool way that God has used your heart and some of your giftings to help people in a unique way. And even just being able to discover, like, man, the impact that I want to have on the individual employee is not going to happen in the context of me being the owner and them being the employee.
Right.
Like, there is that barrier that I'm sure you just kept recognizing. So that's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't need to be directly involved, but I want to be a part of it. So with who I am and my core competencies, I have the ability to think about something and create something. I don't really have the ability to really manage and maintain and run it.
Yeah.
That's just not who I am.
Yeah.
So I got to be who I am and try to figure that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have two more questions. I could easily ask like 30, 40 more.
Yeah.
But just to keep this not too long, what is a decision, business decision, that you had to make that wouldn't make sense to the world, but God specifically called you to?
Yeah, I think that's probably easy question to answer because
I have an idea of what you might say, but we'll see.
Oh, really? Well, after I answer, you have to tell me.
Yeah.
So we were offered a very nice offer for one of our delivery companies, two of them, actually. It made all the remunerative sense in the world to take the deal. But our manager at the time, I don't think was at a place where he could handle the transition. I'm not trying to speak ill of him at all.
Yeah,
he just in his life,
it wasn't in his.
It would have been
interest.
too much, man. Like it would just been a lot, and so we chose not to do it. And it really made absolutely zero financial sense. In fact, it hurt us on that level. But I still think, I always say I'm in the business of building up people and I'm using companies to do it. So in that sense, it was a great business decision. But
from the world's view.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And even I've questioned at times if I'm really honest. Like maybe we should have just did it and trusted the Lord with it, because now we have to probably, anyways, it's just a very different scenario.
What I thought you might go into, and maybe we'll just point to one of your books that you talk about it in, was the story of a business partner many years ago committing fraud against you, and that you technically didn't have to pay back. How much was it?
$945,000.
$945,000 back to investors.
Yeah.
But you and Barbara knew it was the right thing to do and ended up finding a way over time to
that's the Better Off Without Jesus book. I tell that story. But I mean, The bottom line was like, I was a part of getting these people involved in it. And we just thought it was the right thing to do. And, it took us about 5 years to like reconcile everything with everybody. But yeah.
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 I just love, for those listening, like as many stories as we can unfold that share how God calls us to do things that on paper, based on specifically American culture and ideals, make no sense. And some of those decisions end up like making a huge impact on someone who doesn't know the Lord. And some of those things I think God is doing solely for our own hearts.
Yeah.
Like, I want to shape and form your heart. I'm going to call you to this. Some people may never know that this happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's transformative.
Oh my gosh. It's unreal. Yeah. But I could sleep at night.
Yep. That's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
The last question I'm going to ask is, this podcast is really focused on young men and potentially some young women who are trying to navigate their purpose and identity in Jesus within their vocation. What advice would you give to fresh Christian Chuck, his early 20s, about pursuing his career and vocation, and or for these younger people in their 18, early 20s, even into their 30s? What advice would you give from your career path?
I think I would say be intentional, but don't overthink it and avoid idealism. So like, and I know that sounds probably really like boohoo on everything, but on one hand, I think people get analysis paralysis because they overthink it.
Sure.
And they're trying to figure out everything. And the truth is you don't know who you are yet. So don't overthink it. Just go do something. Like get a job, take a gap year or whatever it is, but do something so that you can learn who you are. And you'll only learn who you are in relationship to others. So as you relate to other people, you're going to learn who you are. So don't overthink it. But also avoid like idealism, like you're going to conquer the world. That's an arrogant American mentality. The truth is you're not going to change the city. You're just not going to do it. You can make impact on people, sure. But don't overthink on an idealistic level. I used to meet with church planters all the time. They're like, I want to plant a church that plants churches. And we're like, hey, I just would say, hey man, like, let's start with one. If you can get one off, that's going to be a huge win. So can we just focus there? Do you have a group of people,
Yeah.
So try to avoid the idealism and trust the Lord with using you. Now you might be more optimistic and visionary and all those kinds of things, but just be really careful because you could actually become known as a person that has all these ideas, but you don't do anything. Like just do something and don't overthink it. And trust God with the results of that.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned the podcast, like, I don't know, you're just doing something. Like I know one way to not have impact is don't do anything. Just think and throw out ideas. That's not going to have an impact. Like just do something and then trust the Lord with the end result of it.
I love that. Yeah, I think my 2 cents to add on that is I think it's very easy in that vein of idealism to, when you start to pursue something, kind of like what you said about the church who wants to plant a church that plants a church. God's entire purpose for that person and like them being faithful and walking could have been just one church.
Right. Yeah.
And like, but if their vision and ideal is that it's a church that plants churches and they don't achieve that, they feel like a failure when God may have had them in complete success.
Right.
And so how we frame what we're doing can make us not feel like we're persisting in our purpose,
Right.
but rather that we're just, a failure.
Yeah. And that's why I come back to just do something. Like I just had a young guy tell me, he's like, his dad told me that he told him. So he's like, I want to do what Chuck does and just own all these companies. I asked the dad, I was like, what'd you tell him? He goes, well, maybe in 30 more years you'd be able to do that, because he's 30 years younger than I am. And as we talk about it, I actually had breakfast with the guy, and I said, man, if you want to do that, then you need to buy a company and fix it, and then make it profitable so that you can buy another one. You don't just like start up here.
Yeah.
It just never happens.
Yeah.
Just do something, like start somewhere. And you have to trust God in that, where, okay, Lord, I'm going to do one thing and care for one orphan, care for one widow. And if the Lord creates an avenue for more, well, maybe you'll end up with an organization, or just do one job at one company to learn one industry. And maybe the Lord will lead you to owning a company one day, or maybe multiple companies in that industry. I don't know.
Yeah.
But you just got to do something.
Well, Chuck, thanks so much for flying all the way out to the East Coast in the little pocket of North Carolina that's not underwater, that God protected, and just being a part of this conversation.
Yeah, man.
I appreciate the transparency, the discussion, and I pray that it really has the impact even on just one person's life as they navigate these really challenging ideas of how to persist in the God-given purpose that you've been given.
Yeah, maybe our moms will watch this.
Yeah. Awesome.
No, thanks, man.
Thank you. And for those of you who listened or watched this, I just hope that you're encouraged and that you know that as long as you're pursuing the Lord, trying to put Him first, going away from our idealism, what we want, and truly living in what God has called us to, God can do incredible things that we may not ever see the fruit of on this side of heaven. But yeah, my encouragement is that you would do that while persisting in purpose. See you in the next episode.